Now I see we've got a few people on the line. We've got Mark Giese, Ninoji-san, Dave Moore, and of course Jim Hutchinson and myself. I guess I'll hand over to Mark to chair the spec team meeting today.
Thanks, Shane. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Go to... Let me know when you can see the PowerPoint.
Working good? Perfectly.
Okay, great. So I think we had a very impactful meeting last time in the first of the month. And I want to talk about some of the topics we discussed, and particularly this notion of restructuring the flow of the spec. So originally we were thinking about the next version to be kind of a small increment to the 2.1. And the 2.1, by the way, is the one that's in front of the ISO Standards Committee, which is very close to 2.0. But after getting a lot of feedback from different people, it seems like we have some good recommendations on how we might restructure the document a little bit. I don't think it's going to fundamentally change a lot of the requirements, but it'll give a little bit better of a flow and a little bit more clarity from what people might expect when reading the spec for the first time. And by the way, the feedback is coming from people who are actually reviewing the spec for the first time. And I'll talk about a little bit more about that in detail. So it's no longer this minor update, and we're looking at targeting possibly an 18 to 24 month time frame. Okay. Any comments about that? Because that is a change since we've last spoke.
So, Mark, hi, can you hear me okay? This is Dave.
Yes. Hi, Dave.
Hey, yeah, good to be hearing everybody's voices, by the way. And thanks for that. But I was thinking about the 18 to 24 month time frame. Would it make sense for us to not actually specify that for now and basically let the ISO ecosystem kind of absorb the specification and then see what feedback we get over the next maybe even year after release, and then based on that feedback decide what that next release should be. I worry that if we tell the market that we have this new specification, it's a new standard, and it's going to iterate in 18 months, then because there's a lot of heavy lifting, people might be like, if it's, because I think it's measured in terms of like, not even months, it might even be years for some of the bigger organizations. And it's really, we want this to work for both big and small. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
I think that's probably a wise step to take. I think we were just thinking last time that was probably a little bigger than we initially anticipated, but why commit to a time frame? Because like you said, might spook some people. They might get scared that thinking that I've already put this investment, I'll wait till the next version comes out. And the other thing we want to make sure that we address is that people don't get too concerned that when we do come out with a new spec, that it's going to be a big change from what they've already adopted. So
yeah, because our audience goes from, like the people that know about OpenChain, it goes from the people that care about open source and have been working on it. Once it's an ISO spec, it's going to be about people that are like, what is this new standard? And they will come after it without knowledge, which is actually a good thing because they're the exact folks that need to become more knowledgeable, probably. But, it's, anyway.
Yeah, and I think what we're starting to see, and we anticipate, to your point, that we expect a lot more feedback, especially when it gets that blessing, right? The ISO blessing. So we should just be prepared to accommodate that and have a longer runway without being very specific. I agree.
Thanks.
To the end of that revised input, is there another way to address that, such as through updates to onboarding or other materials?
Yeah, I mean, one of the comments I made in last meeting was, one thing we can do is, one place we can definitely augment is the FAQ, the spec FAQ. It provides additional clarification when we make that clarification in a new version of the spec. We don't have to wait for the spec to come out to provide that clarification. Some of the core pieces of feedback are around clarifying what the spec is intending to say, right? So that's one place, is the FAQ. But perhaps there are other areas, maybe the onboarding. Any additional thoughts about that, or possible places?
Joe, you want to mute? I like it.
No, I was thinking about that. I don't know exactly what tripped them up, so I'm not sure where else to recommend it. But I think the FAQ sounds like a fine place. And then if it was specific to like the concerns of a smaller company or the concerns of somebody who's outsourcing, you know, their conformance, then the FAQ might be a really good place.
Mm-hmm. So definitely we'll have an active FAQ. I'll start that up now and I don't anticipate any major ones being added at this moment, but once we see something that would really help others with that bridge, then definitely. Okay, and just as a reminder, you know, the key considerations here are, you know, clearly the feedback from the people who are already conforming, right? And clearly, we're really going to pay attention to the feedback for the people struggling to become conformant. And ultimately, we are going to still be this core, you know, specification where we describe all what we would consider the necessary requirements, the minimum requirements that every quality program should adhere to. Okay, so that still holds true. And then this is another topic that we had discussed. We haven't really delved into it much, but this idea, we're starting to get this, you know, inquiries about, well, what about security vulnerabilities? And I know in very early days, we discussed a possible module. Now, this is not intended to be a mandatory part of the spec. Well, let me back up even further. This is really an exploratory discussion. We don't even anticipate necessarily we'll even include anything about security vulnerabilities in this next major release. It was more about a discussion. And it really came about because the target of OpenChain is largely about, the spec is about creating trust around the use of open source. And the very first place you're going to start, and it's at the foundation, clearly is license compliance. You can't use it unless you comply, right? But another factor that's growing, you know, exponentially almost, is that concerns around security and vulnerabilities in open source. And the question is, should we be playing a role, possibly around that trust factor? And what we're thinking about is a possible added on option that you can choose to go for, but you don't have to in order to conform with the basic spec. So for those who haven't been here before, any thoughts about that? About that exploratory activity? Is it possibly pushing too further outside the scope of where we should be?
So, for example, would it be, for, you know, let's say you get into some security space and we have some additional requirements in that area. So that would be an add-on module on top of OpenChain?
Yes. The OpenChain, my anticipation would be what we have now in the spec today is absolutely necessary to be OpenChain conforming. If you want to earn an additional badge, I guess sometimes they refer to these as badges, right? And you want to convey a certain trust around open source with respect to security, then you would have this additional thing that you could choose to go. And we might even have others. Maybe, again, we might have export. I'm not saying we will, but these would be add-ons. There's always going to be the basic foundation, and that's what we're really talking about today. But this idea of adding additional options to build more trust in the supply chain around the open source with respect to security. I can say I'm getting more and more questions. Like recently, we were audited by a major vendor. We get audited several times a year. They often come in and they want to understand our software development lifecycle. And one of the basic questions we'll get is, how do you handle open source? And I always pull out, and it always works really well, is I pull out the spec, the OpenChain spec. I say, well, OpenChain conforming. Let's talk about that. It really focuses the discussion. It gives it real structure, and we're usually done within an hour, and we can point to all the artifacts that show that we're conforming. But the thing that really came up in the last one was a lot more questions around, all right, you're managing open source. What do you do for security and, the management of this, the quality of the stability of the software around open source? It's almost as if this is becoming an additional requirement for a compliance group. Doesn't have to belong in the compliance group, by the way. So I've said it quite a bit there. Does that seem like a reasonable thing to do? Or are there concerns?
I think architecturally, if we want to go that direction, I think that's the most sensible way to go. But we should probably have a discussion on what those, optional areas might be. I know I'm going. The reason why I mentioned security, and maybe that's why we're talking about it, is because I know from prior discussions with you, and I think this was even just prior to 2.0. That you were thinking that security would be a good complement to OpenChain as a future addition. It may be. I think we need to have that conversation, and maybe there's sufficient interest, to serve that particular need.
That's right, and that's what we're going to do. We're just going to have an exploratory discussion around it this go around, unless it really starts to solidify. And we may very well at the end decide, no, that's not the option. We don't want to go that path at all. It's a very possible outcome. So it's more about, seeing if there is, the right complementary fit. Okay, so these are the objectives for our 3.0 release. This is how we're going to guide our discussions. I always put this up real quick. Point people to the fact that we have the a wiki where you can find the list of issues. I'm sorry, we have a wiki, and then we have the FAQ, which I recommend anybody who contributes to the spec to read the FAQ. We have the draft, and then we have the issues list. Now, I'm starting off every meeting with the opportunity for, in addition to communicating some issues that they might want to discuss on the issues list or in the email list, I like to have this meeting as an opportunity for people to introduce possible new comments or feedback about the spec. So, and then we could possibly, focus on those today, or we can go back to the issues list. So let me pause for a second. Is there any particular things that people are seeing in the spec that they would like to provide feedback on and possibly give us something to talk about?
Still love it.
Okay. Moving on, no new topics then. I would like to pick up with some of the discussions we had last time. I always try to make a little overlap with the previous meeting because they're in two different really times of the day and really hit different time zones. And last time, what we talked about really made us think hard about changing the ordering of things. But this is not exactly, the second item we're going to cover will really touch on that. But one of the first topics we discussed was simply updating the definition of program. And one of the key pieces of feedback here is just adding this additional wording in. So there's this notion that we described that a definition of a program, and the feedback was that maybe we should consider enhancing the definition to make reference to section 1.4, which is talks about the program scope, and that's a requirement, and we can look at that in a second. That's a requirement that that requires someone to describe exact scope of their program, whether they're a specific department within their company, or they're the entire organization, or they're a particular product line. So let me see if I can bring up the spec. See the spec here. So if I go to the definition section, we're going to see that definition. And really the only thing it's missing is reference to that section 1.4. It's just saying, here's the definition of a program. But if I go down to it's really 3.1.4. It's right here. So they're just simply saying, let's talk about it, make sure that we're defining it. And the definition includes this notion of scope.
Yep.
Okay. And I think the general consensus was that seemed like a reasonable thing to do What's going to be a little bit more dramatic, and the reason why I spend a little time on this program scope is the next issue we're going to talk about is fundamentally moving this section a little bit. Okay, but that wouldn't change this piece of feedback we have here. So does anybody have any concerns about possibly augmenting the definition?
I think it's consistent with what we, intended, back in the earlier versions. Do you see any meaningful difference? I don't see it.
No, and I think what's really, I think I like about it is it really puts more focus on that notion of scope, because we want to emphasize that every organization can choose their scope as long as they define their scope. And sometimes an organization wants to do their entire organization. Sometimes they just want to do a subsection of the organization. I think it gives the spec more power, more adoptability.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay.
Do we have a OSPO description in there? Open Source Program Office, or is program the entire thing?
I don't believe we have a definition of program office, although I'm not sure we make reference to a program office. I don't think we have a reference to it, therefore we wouldn't necessarily define it.
Okay.
But as we go along, I mean, because we do refer to that where compliance takes place in our organization in the Open Source Program Office. However, it doesn't have to necessarily, have that formal definition, right?
Yeah, I was just looking for the definitions, not to
see if it's consistent
negatively with each other. Yeah.
Yeah. So the next one is really an interesting one. So this is where we started to talk about changing a little bit of the ordering of the document, because with a fresh pair of eyes, we're starting to see that there's a slightly more logical ordering of things. So in the beginning, we had this very main section, which is called, really now it's 3.1.1, right, and 3.1.2. But the first one would be policy. So if we go back to the actual document, you'll see here that we have policy, right? And it requires someone to specify and make sure they have a policy in place. And then if you come down here a little bit more, there's awareness, and then there's you have awareness of the policy, and then they have then we have program scope. What they're recommending is we should define program scope right up front, because that's the most important thing. That's what we're talking about, and then we talk about the policy with respect to that program, which is defined by the scope. So what they're really requesting here is that we order things a little differently. Doesn't mean we fundamentally change the semantics of these sections. So, and again, it's that idea that maybe before you really can talk about policy, you should have the thing defined within, as one of the first steps.
Mm-hmm. What is the typical way that other ISO standards frame that kind of issue in terms of sequencing?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I do have a book, and I'll have to reference it, on ISO 9001, 2015. It's kind of like puts it in simple terms, and I'll look at what ordering they have there. I think it's worth looking at.
So I just one data point. I appreciate the logic behind the suggestion. What I would suggest is maybe just ask the people that, who is our ISO consultant? But we
Gentleman
have
by the name of Rex. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe he might have an idea on how that sequencing might be best. But substantively,
sure.
It's not going to change the meaning of the section. It's just going to be an easier sequencing for a new reader, and perhaps one that's coming at it from the perspective of ISO standards.
Mm-hmm.
I can take that as an action item to reach out to Rex.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sure. So what I ended up doing, and I'm not sure it's worth putting it up now, but I did try to make the markup. So what I started to do is make changes to the spec, and I moved up program scope. It does, because I moved it up doesn't mean it's definitive. I want this to sit for a while, but I'm going to put out a draft, and so we can at least see it. And if we find that it doesn't sit well, we can move it back. but I would, I'll take the markup and put out, without the markup, make it more easy to read. But that would be the ordering we'd see. Now, the other comment that came up was whether this section here belongs in this first part. So let me go back to the original version, so maybe a little easier to look at this. Spec, all right, now we have 3.1, it's called Program Foundation. And under Program Foundation, we would have potentially the actual scope, policy, and awareness. Now there's competences here. This is where we talk about training largely. And then there's this notion of awareness, okay? And the comment that they made was that they felt like those three sections, the program, scope, policy, and awareness, were very relevant to this Program Foundation part. But felt that this section, again, not changing the real semantics of it, should potentially be moved, I believe, to the next section, which is the major area of the spec would be called, I'll call them pillars. So we have the first one is Program Foundation pillar. Then we have this what's called the relevant tasks defined and supported. And so we talk about, having access to the organization. We talk about, are things effectively resourced? And yeah, that's largely where and they felt like one of the relevant tasks should be training. I'll use the word training for simplicity, but really it would be essentially moving this section, and I'll let you look at it a little longer here. This one right here cuts across. And this is how we address the whole training consideration, which in itself was a lengthy discussion last round.
So it would basically be, a cut and paste into this section here?
Yes. For now, I would just assume that we're going to cut and paste this and move it. Now, if we choose for other reasons to revisit the text for a different reason, we would do that under a different thread and discussion. But for now, it would largely be take this section as is, keep 100% of the semantics, and move it down into another pillar of the document. And again, I call this Program Foundation is one pillar, and the other pillar that we move it to would be, I know it's a little confusing sometimes, the next pillar, which is would be called relevant tasks defined and supported. By the way, just to see what other pillars are in the document, we have the next pillar is, this is where we have the bill of materials, where we basically assume that we have the review and approval. That's another pillar. And then finally, the other pillar is understanding open source communities engagements. So these are the core sections of the document.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's already been refactored for ISO. I think my comment here would be the same as the last one, just, because, if it was refactored for a reason and sequenced in certain ways, there's pros and cons.
Yeah, let's use that as a strong guide. Let's put a little bit more of a priority on looking at that, you're saying. What's interesting is the awareness part, I know for a fact, was right alongside the competence within that ISO 9001. Because that's what influenced me. I remember reading, I wanted to see how they did training, and they really broke training up into these two, competence and awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kept those together and tried to model them as best possible. So the question would be, if that holds true for that particular ISO spec, should we possibly be keeping them together and moving them together? That's an open question.
It's interesting. What do we think about the idea that historically, open source program offices have been run by engineers and sometimes lawyers, who have already been involved with open source. Mirroring ISO is, I think, an interesting idea. Do we think that ISO, call it type of people, might be also drafted, in a sense, to start running an OPO, an OSPO?
In other words, yeah, get that kind of mindset involved.
In other words, if we're drafting for consistency for with ISO 9001, which makes sense to me, maybe there's sort of, besides just consistency, increased digestibility, for people that are already familiar with, sequencing in ISO 9001.
Sure. In other words, reach out to those who have more, like Rex would be another, obviously this is another example for Rex to comment on, and if possible others. Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that I'm not quite sure how that's going to all work out. I'm excited for the whole certification, ISO certification.
Yeah.
I'm really interested to see how the dynamics are and how, how involved they are, and what comments we get even on 2.1, if any. So
yeah.
But definitely, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I think it's a very important consideration. Let's make sure we are, keeping it true to how ISO evolves or it works and flows and so forth. Yeah. Okay. So we'll definitely do that. We'll definitely study the ISO approach and apply it here or compare it to here. From a general personal gut, do people have concerns with us possibly reorganizing to where we actually move this section competence to go back to the next section just before? And I know it's hard sometimes because it may not be fresh in your heads, but back to again, it would be moving. Again, we'll compare it to the ISO standards, but I just want to see if people have any negative reactions.
What do you think, Mark? Do you think that these are good architectural adjustments?
I think it is. I think that because of what the topic of the pillar is, relevant tasks defined and supported. So I think training and education is a meaningful task, right? That's kind of supported. It's a supportive task to ensuring compliance. Now, whether we move access, and I would like to make sure that we probably preserve access and the competence. And if we have to move them together, possibly move them together.
Okay.
I don't have strong concerns for it. I think it's not going to fundamentally change either how people can get through conformance, right, or with our spec. And I don't think it's going to change the meaning of things. And it might be a more natural one, but I think ultimately the guide for us to use is to make sure that it's still consistent with ISO, other ISO standards.
Yeah, that sounds good. I get the same sense, and I just if I read from ISO experts is that these are good changes to make, then I think that you'll get very little resistance from anyone really, because it's not a substantive change.
Okay. And again, we'll make these changes and we'll put them out there and we'll see how people react. Because I think once I put out a draft, it may raise a little alarm because there are a lot of people out there who are, gone through the conformance and they're going to say, oh, but they have to understand it's not as dramatic of a change as they may think. That's one concern I have. People get a little scared that this is a big change.
One thing you might want to consider, Mark, is, for the working version, to just keep it as a list of comments without actually, I know that you wanted to see how it looks, but post ISO certification or when ISO approval, you'll have a lot of eyes that, that will be on this. And I think it's easier for those fresh eyes to see that there's a bunch of comments and they can add more comments and provide comments if they wanted to, but not an active, revision,
sure.
not a redline revision.
Don't go there yet. Yeah, leave it out there for a little bit more of a digestion and comments.
Yeah, so people know that. Yeah, so people know that the version that they got and downloaded and that was approved, is in fact the very latest words.
Yes. Okay. Good point. I agree with you. I was trying to get a perspective of it by rearranging it, but you're absolutely right. I mean, we should just, it looks like almost like we've made the decision. And
Right.
I don't want to convey that.
Yeah, it's not in fast motion. It's
Right.
being actively discussed, but not in motion to change. So feel free to adopt. We are being very deliberate here.
Mm-hmm. No, good points. Okay, so the next one was okay. So I don't know if I discussed the objectives part yet. So okay, it's over here. So what we ended up doing is, in addition to having a program scope, right? The comment was to augment it a little bit more. So we would say we had clearly defines the scope and limits of the program. The word objectives were not included in the current version of the spec. And they pointed out that in 1.3, in the awareness section, we talk about relevant objective, open source objectives, but we don't really make reference to objectives. And they thought when you define a scope, your program scope, which is a very important part of this, in fact, it's probably one of the initial things you do, that you include in your scope definition objectives of your program. Not everybody's going to have the same objectives, but objectives might be, for example, we want to maintain this program to attract talent, right? Or we want to be able to give back to the community because of all the software we use, or whatever objectives you choose. So I don't think this is a huge addition or shifting of the meaning, but it is a slightly more enhanced part of the definition. I'll show you where that would take place. So going back to the spec. So in the awareness, here we talk about the relevant open source objectives, but we really don't make any reference to that any other place in the spec. And the comment was, when we actually, assuming we haven't moved this, it doesn't matter whether we move it or not, that we would include that in the definition here. Clearly define the scope and limits of the program. And they're simply recommending that we put in, defines the scope, comma, objectives, and limits of the program. So the word objectives would go here to complement this over here.
And that creates more consistency in terms of how the word objectives is introduced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially if this gets moved up to the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I do feel particularly good about moving this section up, again, without radically changing anything, because I think at the core of this is it's all about a program, and sometimes people are confused about that, right? It is about your program, and your program is customized the way you choose it to be. And here we're just simply saying you probably should have objectives in that program. I think it's a pretty reasonable thing to ask. So the scope is key, right? What your objectives are, and limits in some ways are part of scope, I guess. So
yeah, I think it's a very thoughtful comment. I like the way that
that works out. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay. Let's see what we got here. And also in the this would be a complementary to that as well. In the mention of objectives in the policy, here we have, and we'll go look at that in a second, a documented open source policy that reflects the scope, objectives, and limits of the program. So they're asking us to add in this text here. So if we go back to the spec, and we looked at the policy, which is one, they're adding that text right here. Right now we say a documented open source policy. And it's, in some ways the program scope would come before here, right before it. And what they're recommending is that we say a documented open source policy that reflects, oops, I can't highlight when it's presented, but that reflects the scope, objectives, and limits of the program. Again, bringing a little bit more consistency and tying things together a little tighter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Makes sense to me.
Okay. All right. Okay, moving on to the, let's see. I'll let you guys read this for a second. It's a little more lengthier. And it gets a little harder. Actually, let me see if I have another one here. No, we don't. Okay. So here we're going to go, I'll go back to bullets 2.2 and 2.25. This is a little harder. It's better to look at this section, contents of effectively resourced. Go back to the spec. Okay. So in some ways, you see this one right here. This is the fifth bullet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? A documented procedure for handling the review and remediation of non-compliant cases. And what they're asking for, they suggest that we combine the fifth bullet of this one with the open source license obligations. So I'll go 1.5. I'll show you what that section is. So this, they're thinking that this one would belong up with this one here. So a process shall exist for the identification of licenses, determine obligations, restrictions, and rights granted by each license. Now we have a requirement here that someone has to satisfy. And they're actually recommending that we move this one here up to that one. They feel it's a little bit more consistent with that. So that's 1.5 right here. I know it's a little hard to flip between the two, but the key here is this is about, we're making sure that they have a way of systematically reviewing licenses. Okay, and they're thinking that when you look at this bullet, it may not be as consistent with, it doesn't like conflict with anything. They thought that it would be more appropriate or more better chemistry, I guess, or better fitting up there.
Yeah, because this 3225 actually deals with a procedure, and 322, sorry, the other items in 322 are more about making sure that there are people that are accountable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's more like roles and responsibilities. Yeah.
Yeah. I see the logic.
And it wouldn't, again, change. Everybody's still required to have this item completed. It's just a more natural fit. So you go in the obligations section here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you go back to that that slide? I feel like I'm missing an edit in. So this is based on edits to version 2.0.
Yes. So
okay,
that
so
the numbering's off. It's usually a 3 dot and then the 2 dot 2 dot. So in the case of you'd have a .3 in front of this one. And probably a 3. Yeah, the numbering's off because of the ISO caused us to renumber things without really moving them around.
Yeah.
I would say gave it finer granular numbering. So yeah, that's essentially, I think, what's being asked there. And I think that's fine. I think it is a little bit more related. We could have easily have, I think, included it there initially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay.
How much do these changes impact, the conformance tooling that,
Yeah.
Gary made?
This is gonna, all the things we discussed today are gonna shift things around. It's not gonna eliminate one or add one right now. Well, we haven't discussed anything that would do that. What it will do is it will force the form to be readjusted, rearranged, the questionnaire, in a significant way. But again, each of the requirements that are in the spec today are there. And if you've already done conformance against that earlier version of the spec, all your evidence that you've gathered up and saved would be applicable to this current rearrangement of the spec, just to be in a different order. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so they're looking at the third bullet of 2.2 and merging with the policies. Last topic we can look at. So so they're looking at a process exists for reviewing and updating the policy and supporting tasks. So let's see if we can look at 3.22. See. I always have a little hard time finding. See if I can, let me just see. Should we combine the third bullet of 2.2? I'm assuming, let's see, here it is.
Mm-hmm. Looks like it.
And what they're suggesting is that this bullet be moved up to the policy one, which is here. There's really no bullets here right now, but they feel that should be there. And the policy is obviously written. We assume that there's some kind of document that's written that describes the policy. And we have to make sure, I have to see if there's a particular verification material artifact that actually corresponds to it. So come back down here. There's not really a direct item here that corresponds to this one. Now, it's also possible to keep it here.
This change, the logic behind this change proposal is that everything that relates to creation of the policy and maintenance of the policy and messaging about the existence of the policy belong together.
Mm-hmm. Which would make sense in a way, so. Mm-hmm. And I think it's something, again, we can achieve without materially changing the requirements.
I think I agree with this edit too. I'm reluctant to again, see a lot of messaging around this is a rapidly changing specification. So it's not. I mean, as long as we make sure that people see that these are comments that we have identified and we think are good to incorporate in the future version. I think that's, maybe, what do you think, Mark? Is that enough work for now for these items?
Yes, I do. I think what we probably should do is slow down the process a little now. I mean, this was a big change that came out last time, and then just put these comments out there and let people look at it.
Yeah.
And make comments on the comments.
Mm-hmm.
Because we are going through a lot of issues in the last few meetings. So I think we should slow it down a little bit and go to the mailing list, and maybe even shorten these meetings, hold it, have an opportunity to discuss them. And if not, we can conclude it. We don't have to cover tons of ground right now, especially since we're waiting for the ISO certification to come out.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts about the degree of these changes or the pace we're going at? Okay, I think I'm going to do is we covered quite a bit and really good comments. I'm going to say for this meeting, I'm going to conclude it here, and I'm going to go back and try to put back the spec the way it was, and put comments in the margins, and possibly, you know, create an FAQ to kind of suggest. I might even create like a FAQ for this process we're going through, the next round of this. It's one thing to have an FAQ for the spec. It makes clarification about the spec. I'm tempted to even write up a FAQ to calm people's concerns around the actual process we're going through to rev on the spec. So an FAQ for the process of updating the spec. Because I think there'll be a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. Just before you wrap up, Mark, I just want to, you know, tell you that this has been a long process. This is really, you know, a testament to your leadership, you know, on, you know, creating a specification that has, I think so far, you know, knock on wood, has you know, been doing very well, you know, in the standardization process. And you know, when September 20 something hits, you know, this is like, it's like you and Shane giving birth. This is your baby.
Yeah, no, totally. I have to say that Shane's support has been tremendous in getting the whole thing through the process. And I think I'm very appreciative of the 200 plus people that we've actually had provide the feedback. It's been a challenging, a good, healthy, fun challenge to coordinate. But I think that those comments of all the people, it's a true open source initiative in that sense.
Yep. Yeah, agree.
Okay, great. Thank you for all the comments, and we'll take that, and I'll update it, and I'll update the mailing list. Thanks, everyone.